The air on Velur Prime smelled like copper and citrus, an oddly pleasant combination, thought Soren Naves as he stepped off the shuttle ramp. His boots sank slightly into the spongy blue moss that covered the royal landing pad. He adjusted the strap of his pack, glanced once at the towering crystalline spires of the capital city ahead, and sighed. A diplomatic job again. He'd barely finished a 2-month stint mediating a trade dispute between Mars-based Terrans and the aquatic Fernari of Kelmer 12. Now Earth's Interstellar Cultural Exchange Office had dropped him here, on Velur Prime, with a vague mission: build rapport with the royal caste, introduce human customs, avoid war. Soren wasn't even a diplomat by training. He'd been an anthropologist before the Earth Galactic Alliance took notice of his fieldwork on post-catastrophe cultures. Apparently, that qualified him to deal with emperors who had 10 sensory limbs and an ego the size of Jupiter. A guard approached, tall, scaly, and dressed in radiant robes that shimmered with embedded gemstones. He held up a hand, fingers spread in a gesture Soren vaguely remembered from the briefing videos. "I am Havak's escort to Her Radiance, royal efficient of the Lysari lineage. You are the Terran." Soren nodded. "Soren Naves, yes, thanks for the welcome." Havak's eyes blinked vertically. "There is no need to express gratitude, your presence was mandated." "Right, of course." Havak's turned on his heel and began walking. Soren followed, noting how the guard's footsteps barely disturbed the moss. He tried to replicate the gait and failed spectacularly. His boots squelched loudly with each step. They passed under an archway made of translucent mineral, its surface humming faintly as if it were alive. Inside, the palace gleamed literally. The walls were polished to a mirror-like sheen, and the ceiling pulsed with bioluminescent patterns. Soren had to blink several times to keep his eyes from watering. They were ushered into a throne room where the royal family of Velur awaited. The Empress, a towering figure in a gown of woven light, stared at him with 3 eyes and an expression that could only be described as bored. "You are the primitive," she said. Soren cleared his throat. "I'm the representative from Earth, yes." "One and the same," she replied, waving a hand. "We have studied your language, your social systems, and your so-called art. It is quaint." Soren held his tongue. He'd learned early on that arguing never helped. Instead, he nodded. "I understand your skepticism. I'm here to learn from you as much as to share." The Empress tilted her head. "We allow your presence out of curiosity, not respect. Do not confuse the two." "Understood." She turned to Havak's. "Assign him quarters near the archives. If he is to enlighten us, he must first study our greatness." Soren kept his mouth shut until they were well away from the throne room. "She's charming," he muttered. Havak's didn't respond. The days that followed were a blur of rituals, lectures, and exhausting protocol briefings. Soren took notes, asked questions, and did his best to avoid offending anyone. The Velurians were obsessed with hierarchy and tradition, and even a misplaced bow could result in a formal reprimand. Still, he found moments of fascination. Their architecture was grown, not built massive structures shaped by genetically engineered coral-like organisms. Their music was created through vibrating mineral panels played with soundless gestures, and their history, though heavily sanitized, was rich with interstellar conquest and philosophical debates that had lasted centuries. But every time Soren tried to share something human, it was met with barely concealed derision. "Your species still buries the dead," one of the royal scholars scoffed during a cultural exchange seminar. "How delightfully archaic." "We honor the memory of the person who passed," Soren explained. "The ritual helps people grieve." "Grief is inefficient," the scholar replied. "On Velur Prime, we dissolve the body and recycle the nutrients. Sentiment has no function." Soren didn't argue, he simply wrote it down. A week later, tragedy struck. One of the Empress's own sons, Prince Kelrix, was killed during a diplomatic skirmish on a border moon. An energy discharge had pierced his transport hull. The news hit the palace like a seismic wave. Mourning banners, long strips of dark crystal, were unfurled across the city, but the actual mourning was sterile. Prince Kelrix's body was placed in a nutrient bath for reclamation within hours. There was no gathering, no eulogy, no ceremony besides the official announcement delivered by a palace aide. Soren observed in silence. "That's it?" he asked Havak's 2 days later. "Yes, the prince's essence has returned to the cycle. He has fulfilled his function." No closure, no community gathering. There is no purpose in emotional redundancy. Soren bit his tongue. A few days later, he received a transmission from Earth. A friend from university Daniel had passed, car accident. The message included the funeral schedule, and without thinking, Soren submitted a formal request to observe the ceremony remotely. The Velurians approved it, albeit with confusion. The funeral was held in a small chapel in Oregon. Soren watched from a private chamber, seated alone. The screen showed Daniel's wife stepping up to the podium, voice trembling as she shared memories of their travels. Friends followed, each one recounting stories, some funny, some devastating. The camera panned to the casket, draped in a simple cloth, surrounded by flowers. Soren barely noticed Havax enter the room behind him. The guard stood silently, watching the screen for several minutes. "They speak of him as if he remains," Havax said. "In a way he does," Soren replied. Havax didn't move. By the end of the ceremony, Soren's eyes were wet. He stood, wiping his face with the back of his hand. "I'd like to take a walk," he said. Havax followed without a word. Later that evening, Soren was summoned to the Empress again. This time the throne room was dim, lit only by soft violet glows. "You conducted a ritual," she said. "I attended a funeral, yes." "You wept." "I lost a friend." The Empress leaned forward. "Your species feels lost this deeply." "Yes." She was silent for a long time, then, "You will perform this ritual here for us." Soren blinked. "You want me to simulate a funeral?" "No, you will conduct a real one for Kelrix." "But his body?" "His biological material is irrelevant. You will reconstruct it, emotionally, symbolically. You will show us what your kind do when someone is gone." Soren hesitated. "I'll need help." "You will have it." The following week was a blur of planning, writing, revising. Soren was given access to Kelrix's records, his writings, speeches, personal logs. He interviewed palace staff, guards, even some of the prince's rivals. It was exhausting and at times emotionally draining. But when the day came, the palace amphitheater was packed. Thousands of Velurians gathered in eerie silence. Soren stood alone at the center, next to a pedestal draped in deep red cloth. On it sat a simple sculpture, a representation of Kelrix's likeness, shaped from translucent resin. Soren took a breath. "Today we gather not to reclaim nutrients or fulfill protocol, but to remember a life." Prince Kelrix was not just a designation or a title. He was curious. He questioned rules in private journals. He once challenged a tutor's lesson on succession. He wrote poetry badly, often, but he tried. He loved citrus fruits, even when they upset his stomach. He once saved a child from drowning on Ekin 7 and never told anyone. The crowd remained still. Soren continued, sharing stories he'd gathered, weaving them into a narrative that painted Kelrix as more than a function. He read one of the prince's poems, even though it was clumsy and amateur. He ended with a moment of silence. Then, without prompting, he placed a small stone on the pedestal. Havax stepped forward. He placed a stone too. Then the Empress. Then the rest. By the end of the hour, the pedestal was covered in thousands of stones. That night, Havax approached Soren in his temporary quarters. "I have never understood death," he said, "not until today." Soren nodded. "Neither do we, but we try." "The Empress wishes to adopt the ritual permanently, a version of it." Soren blinked. "What?" "She has ordered the creation of a mourning hall. You will design it." Soren sat down slowly. "I'm not an architect." "You are now." He laughed, then almost cried again. Velur Prime never looked at humans the same way after that. It was late morning on the 22nd rotation since the ceremony. The mourning hall was still under scaffolding woven from living fiber canes, but that didn't stop a delegation of Velurian architects from forming a semicircle around Soren as he stood ankle-deep in nutrient-rich soil, holding a handful of clay. "I'm not shaping anything yet," he said, glancing at the expectant faces. "This is just testing texture." The tallest among them, an amber-skinned artisan with layered ocular ridges, inclined his head. "We observe." "I noticed," Soren muttered, kneading the clay between his fingers. "You realize human funerary architecture doesn't usually have this much bioluminescence." The artisan didn't blink. "Your species builds for decay, we build for resonance." Soren wiped his hands on a towel, then gestured toward the frame of the structure. "That's the problem. We're designing a space for reflection, not resonance. If the walls sing when people cry, that's intrusive." "They will not sing," the artisan said. "They will hum softly. Mourning should not occur in silence." Soren crouched to examine the root growth at the foundation's edge. "Your Empress said she wanted it to be human, not Velurian with human garnish." A second architect, smaller but with a frill of chartreuse tendrils around her neck, stepped forward. Then you must define what is human, architecturally. Function over grandeur, materials that weather, quiet corners, soft surfaces, no reflective walls. They all collectively tilted their heads. One whispered something in a dialect Soren hadn't heard yet, and another pulled out a schematic pad and began reworking the sketch, muttering in frustration as the glowing symbols shifted under his fingers. He turned away from the crowd and walked to the edge of the site where a small table had been set up. On it was a carafe of water, a stack of slates, and a worn medkit he'd been carrying since his arrival. His ankle had been bothering him since the morning, a persistent ache that flared when he stepped wrong. He sat on a stone bench and rolled up his pant leg. Blood pooling, a voice asked from behind. He twisted around to see Havax watching him, arms folded. Not exactly, Soren said. Old ligament tear, too much hiking in my 20s. These shifts in gravity screw with it. Havax stepped closer. Your species is unusually fragile, yet you endure. Soren pressed a cold pack to the swollen joint. We adapt or we limp. Do your funerals account for the pain of the living? Sometimes, usually with casseroles. Havax blinked slowly. Explain. People bring food, it's a way to help when they don't know what to say. The Velurian process this, so nourishment substitutes for language. It's not a substitute, it's a gesture. Grief makes words clumsy. Havax nodded once and stepped away, disappearing into the architectural huddle. Soren leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the cold seep in. By third rotation that day, the Empress summoned him again, not to the throne room, but to the royal infirmary. When he arrived, he was escorted through a series of antiseptic corridors filled with soft pulsing lights and faint mechanical clicks. A nurse with translucent skin and no visible mouth guided him through a sliding iris door. Inside, the Empress stood beside a low diagnostic table. On it lay a figure, small, motionless, wrapped in a pale membrane. This is Lurex, she said without turning, a cousin's child diagnosed with terminal neurofold collapse. Soren stepped closer. What do you want me to do? I want you to prepare the ritual. He looked at the child. The skin was mottled, the limbs twitching involuntarily. He recognized the symptoms: progressive neuronal disorganization, no known Velurian treatment, fatal within 2 cycles. It hasn't happened yet, Soren said quietly. The funeral comes after. You're skipping the part where people try to hold on. She has no chance. That doesn't matter, you still hold on. The Empress narrowed her eyes. We do not prolong agony. Soren looked her in the face. Then let me help you understand what we do. She didn't respond, but she didn't stop him either. He spent the next 4 hours by Lurex's side, learning her name properly, clicks and tones that didn't translate but that she responded to. He played recordings of Earth lullabies, slowed to frequencies Velurian auditory systems could detect. He taught her how to blink in a pattern that meant I'm still here. When her breathing began to shallow, he called for medical assistance, not to extend her life, but to keep her comfortable. The attending physician offered a neural sedative. No, Soren said, let her go while she knows she's not alone. The Empress remained silent through the fading. When Lurex exhaled her last, the lights in the room dimmed automatically, a programmed response. Soren stood still, hands folded. I don't understand, the Empress said at last. Neither do we, he replied. The next day, the Mourning Hall construction halted. The Empress issued a new decree. All royal deaths would be followed by an observational period, no nutrient reclamation, no reassignment of titles, just reflection. The architects groaned but adapted. That same afternoon, Soren was approached by a group of Velurian scholars requesting interviews. Not about funeral rites this time, but about human resilience. Your people survive by absorbing pain, one scholar said. You metabolize it into function. How? We don't always, Soren said. Sometimes we break first. And then someone else reminds us how to stand back up. The scholar scribbled furiously, antennae twitching. Later that week, Soren received a call from an Earth medical team stationed on a nearby moon. A cargo shuttle carrying human workers had exploded during a refueling mishap. 4 survivors, all injured. They'd been brought to a Velurian med hub for emergency care, but complications had arisen. The local staff didn't understand human metabolic crash protocols. Soren commandeered a transport. When he arrived, the med hub director met him at the gate. We have stabilized 3. The fourth female, early maturity, has entered hypovolemic shock. We do not comprehend the threshold tolerances. Her blood ox has plummeted despite cellular reinforcement. Did you initiate a transfusion? Soren asked. We attempted plasma synthesis based on provided schematics. Her system rejected it. Because you're missing the antigen compatibility matrix, you can't synthesize that. The director hesitated. We do not possess a compatible donor. I do. She is not your kin. Soren was already rolling up his sleeve. Doesn't matter, I'm O-positive, universal donor. The director blinked. You will risk your own volume. She's 17, I'll risk a pint. The transfusion was messy. Their equipment wasn't designed for human veins, so they had to rig a manual pump. Soren lay on a cot, watching the color return to the girl's face. Her breathing steadied, her eyes fluttered open. You're gonna be okay, he whispered. She didn't respond, but she squeezed his hand. When he returned to Velur Prime 2 days later, he found the Mourning Hall's frame altered again. The walls now included alcoves for artifacts, personal items, mementos, objects that meant something to the deceased, a place for the living to leave pieces of memory. Havax met him at the gate. We included a section for food offerings, he said, as you described. Soren raised an eyebrow. You're serious. Only sealed items for hygiene. He laughed, wincing as his arm twinged. You're learning. We are observing and adapting. Soren looked at the hall's rising spires. Sounds familiar. That evening he sat alone under the half-grown canopy, a small stone in his hand. He didn't place it anywhere, just held it. The wind shifted. Somewhere in the distance, a mineral panel hummed, not loud, not performative, just a soft, sustained note. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, just to feel the quiet. It was a little past second sunfall when the Empress ordered the final inspection of the Mourning Hall. The structure had matured past its scaffolding stage, the fiber canes now retracted, the living coral dome hardened to a matte sheen, and the interior systems fully acclimated to atmospheric consistency. Soren stood just beyond the entrance, brushing soil from his sleeves, when Havax approached carrying a ceremonial ledger with edges worn from use. You are expected inside, Havax said. I figured, Soren replied, adjusting the cuff over the scar on his forearm, the one from the transfusion site. She wants the walk-through now. She has brought observers from the Trinax Council, delegates from 6 systems. She believes they must see it before the blessing is recorded. Soren exhaled. All right, you coming in with me. Protocol requires I remain at the threshold unless summoned, but I will hear and remember. Inside, the temperature dropped slightly. The Mourning Hall had no artificial climate control. Instead, it used the breath of the living walls, slow exhalations of filtered air cooled by deep-rooted fungal pockets. It gave the space a stillness that wasn't silence, more like presence without pressure. The Empress stood beneath the central arch, flanked by 2 dark-robed scholars and a being with translucent limbs that shimmered faintly, a Trinax delegate by the look of it. Soren walked in, nodding politely, and stopped just short of the memory pedestal. The Empress gestured to the chamber. You will explain. Soren glanced around at the alcoves, 12 in total, each designed to hold a single object from the deceased. The walls were embedded with mineral panels that captured sound only when touched deliberately. At the far end, a shallow pool reflected the sky through an oculus in the dome, its surface disturbed by slow drips from a suspended root system above. You don't need a priest here, Soren said, or a technician. You need someone who remembers the person. The ritual begins when they step forward and place their memory item in the alcove, not to store it, to offer it. The Trinax delegate tilted their head. Is there a prescribed item? No, that's the point. It could be a tool, a letter, a pebble they carried in their coat. If it meant something to the one remembering, it belongs here. The Empress stepped forward, her third eye narrowing slightly. And the pool. A place to see themselves while they speak. For humans, mourning isn't passive. We confront it directly. The reflection forces that. There is no icon, said one of the scholars, no symbol of the deceased. They are the symbol, the person speaking. That's the change. You're not honoring a title, you're recalling a life. The Empress turned and faced the pool. You believe grief is a process. I know it is. There was a silence, not the awkward kind, but the one that holds weight. Then the Empress reached under the folds of her sleeve and produced a small metallic object, no larger than a thumb. She walked to the nearest alcove and placed it gently inside. Kelrix once carried this in his boot, a tracking node. He disabled it so he could wander unnoticed. I found it during the reclamation. Nobody moved. The Empress stared at the item for a long moment, then turned away. It will remain here. Soren nodded once. That's the first. Later that evening, after the delegates had departed and the hall had been sealed for the night, Soren returned alone. He stood in the center and listened. The air was cool, the dripping root above the pool rhythmic. He crouched and placed a small photograph on the pedestal, a printed one, creased at the corners, of a group of university friends standing knee-deep in a river. He didn't say anything, just let it sit. 3 days passed before the Empress issued a new directive. The Mourning Hall would not be reserved for royalty. Any Velurian, regardless of caste or function, could request a memory placement. Department heads protested. Elders convened emergency councils, but the Empress didn't rescind the order. Soren spent those days reviewing a request from the Velurian Medical Consortium. They wanted human consultation on palliative care philosophy, not just data perspective. He declined a formal commission but agreed to meet with their board. On the 5th day, he arrived at the medical dome outside the palace perimeter. The lead physician, a narrow-framed Velurian named Parmex, guided him through a suite of rooms designed for end-stage patients. Our containment units are efficient, Parmex said, but we lack clarity on the transitional period. Your kind appears to derive strength from it. You can't reduce that to steps, Soren said, checking the interface on one of the biometric consoles, but you can make room for it. Parmex gestured to a chamber ahead. We have a case, non-royal, no remaining kin. The patient has requested solitude. Soren entered quietly. The being on the bed was pale skin mottled with blue streaks, eyes half-lidded. Their breathing was shallow but steady. They're conscious. Lucid intervals, you may speak. Soren sat beside the bed. I'm not here to fix anything, just to be here. The patient didn't respond, but their fingers twitched slightly. Soren took a small field slate from his satchel and placed it beside the bed. This is a sound recorder. If you feel like saying anything, even just noise, it'll keep it. Someone might listen later. He didn't stay long, just long enough. When he returned to the palace that evening, he found Havax waiting near the garden wall. There's a gathering at the hall, Havax said, unannounced citizens, not nobles. Soren followed him to the dome. Inside, a dozen Velurians stood in a quiet circle, each holding an object, a folded garment, a rusted tool, a strip of woven fiber. He stepped back and let them continue without intrusion. The Empress arrived later that night, unaccompanied. You did not instruct them, she said. No, I just left the door unsealed. I underestimated your species. Soren smiled weary, most do. She looked at the pool, now scattered with petals someone had left floating on the surface. There is strength in remembering. There's survival in it. She nodded once, then turned to leave. Soren remained behind, watching the petals drift. By the end of the week, the hall had received over 400 offerings. Not just from Velur Prime transports arrived from outer colonies, carrying items wrapped in cloth, in stone, in memory. Soren declined interviews. He didn't attend the diplomatic gala held in his honor. Instead, he spent his last evening under the dome, sitting at the edge of the pool, his reflection rippling in the water. He left at dawn. No ceremony, no farewell procession. Just a quiet departure. As his shuttle lifted from the mossy pad, the Mourning Hall faded from view, not in grandeur but in purpose. It no longer needed him. That, he thought, was the point. He entered the stars with no fanfare. But behind him an empire mourned and remembered.